you're trying to enforce, right? Ring, ring, hi Lisa, we're really upset. We need web governance because everyone won't do what we tell them to do. We have a standard and nobody will follow it. They're idiots. We gave them a template. They won't put it on there. Don't you know that our user experience research shows that, see? Don't you know that our user, see? It's just, all you have to do is start talking about it. And it's like, oh, yeah, calling like psychic network. So enforcement is a process and not a power trip. Okay, so it's very, very easy to get on a high horse and say, our user experience research shows that we should be doing X, Y, Z, and then turn to your entire community of web stakeholders and say, so do this. Well, that's not how you get it done. You really need to help them, right? So when you're creating standards, you really need to think about the process that you use for defining the standards, as in be inclusive. Don't just go in a hole and define standards and then tell everybody to follow it. In that inputs and decisions process, make sure people are allowed to give their input. Define and write down your standard. Then actually have a process for disseminating it. I know lots of people who do things like make a style guide and then put it on a shelf. Or make a style guide and turn it into a PDF file and email it to everybody. I mean, we're like web people, for goodness sake. I mean, we can do better than that, right? Good best practice, something that we do for people, is put your standards in a wiki. Totally makes sense. Make sure you think about how you're disseminating that information to people. The other piece is putting some thought in how you're going to actually implement a standard. People don't think about that. They just say, here's the standard, follow it. Well, that doesn't work. If you've got somebody who's got a sub-area of the site that's maybe got 60, 80,000, 100, 500,000 static web pages, and you say to them, here's the new design, maybe they don't know how to do that. Do you implement a content management system? Do you give them a new template? Do you give them education? Do you build community around them? Do you explain to them, train to them how to write for the web? How are you actually implementing your standards? Or are you just turning to them blindly and saying, do what I say? Right, so that's the community building aspect of it, which is really, really important. You have to build a community inside your organization that operates around the web and is all about standards compliance. And then the last piece of it, and this is really key, is the measurement piece of it. How do you tell if everyone's following the standard? Now, if you're a lockdown shop that does object-oriented authoring and data delivery, and you can't get onto the site unless you go through this very structured system, measurements may be not as key when it comes to some structural aspects of it. But if you're like most people and you have a mix of unstructured web pages, giant HTML pages that aren't structured, some of go through a template, there's a mix of things, it's really difficult to tell whether or not people are actually complying with your standards. And so luckily there's some automated ways, and Vimosa will talk about that later on, that you can do that. But the point is, at this point, if you have defined, disseminated, implemented your standards well, measurement becomes easy. Right? So, or I shouldn't say that, compliance is much more, is going to be higher. Right? So you don't have to worry so much. But I think people think about compliance as kind of an end run at the end, right? How come you're not following the standard? Right? And you have to really think about the process that you're using to make sure that the standard is upheld. And then the few rogue people who aren't following, it's easier to kind of check them as well. So I think there's something to be said for that. And so before, I think we might have time for questions. I tried to go speedily along. There are just a few interesting trends that I see in web governance, and these aren't really all about web governance, they're all about the things around the wheel. And one of it that organizations are sort of doing, and an indicator of this is that you all are here. Wow, you weren't there, but the first talk that I gave over on this side of the Atlantic on web governance was maybe four years ago, and I've been talking about web governance for maybe about 7 years and thinking about it for 11, right? So it's, organizations are starting to do it now. They're starting to recognize that it's something to do. And I mean, that's amazing. It really has been like shouting in the wind. And I think that first one, we had like 4 or 5 people who came to a workshop that we gave on web governance. So I think that it's really good that people are really aware of it. I think it's hard work, and I don't mean that to be daunting, but it's hard because of those things that I'm talking about. This is change management work in the organization. It's not just implementing a new technology or doing a new website. You're asking people to behave differently. So just be aware of that, right? It's different than saying we have a new look and feel for the website. People are going to be fearful around it. Some of the recommendations that may come out may be job impacting for people. And when things are job impacting for people, they get emotional and fearful because that's talking about putting food in their kids' mouths and a variety of other things that are very, very serious and people-oriented. I like the fact that social media policy is putting an emphasis on web policy on the whole. It annoys me that people had jumped over everything that was the web to say, let's have a social media policy. It's like you don't have a policy about nothing else for the web, but let's have a social media policy. And it's just like, I think it's because social media is so latched onto by communications people, and they're good communicators. People who do records retention policy maybe aren't the most exciting, right? But that's a huge risk for an organization if you don't know where your web assets are and you can't find them. I know people in government who have years worth of government content underneath their desk on a server, and it's nowhere else. Right, and you all know those stories are true. It tends to be a little bit more structured over here, but because the web started so organically, people just weren't thinking about things like that. So even though social media policy is putting an emphasis on policy, I would really like to see more genuine, serious policy making in the web arena, because I think organizations are operating at tremendous risk by not locking this stuff down. And people who come to talks like this need to kind of elevate themselves up into that echelon instead of it always being conversations about the design should be this and the you know, this technology or whatever. There are bigger fish that, you know, need to be fried in this particular piece. No one wants to integrate web execution, and that's content, data, and applications. Okay, I'm not talking about governance here, I'm talking about execution. If there's anything I could tell you about execution today, it would be, why is it that we segregate those things? I would say because historically we have. Is that a reason to continue doing it when this artifact called a website or this whole digital thing, a web presence, is an integration of content, data, and applications, and someone in New York mentioned processes? Why do we segregate that? Well, because IT and marketing are different. So I don't care about that. I am a proponent for the standalone web team that has all the knowledge and expertise in it to get the work done. But that's a whole other thing.